you're going to start. You begin. I go on, talk a bit about Patrick. I talk a little bit about the area.
Boa tarde, como estão todos? Bom, hoje, finalizando, arrematando a nossa maravilhosa JOTA, nossa jornada de tradução e adaptação, que foi feita este ano online pela Unesp, organizada pela professora Nilce lá. Nós estamos recebendo o nosso Patrick Cattrysse, que é o nosso convidado internacional, que fez a nossa primeira palestra plenária na terça-feira pela manhã. Vocês podem encontrar aqui também toda a palestra dele. E hoje ele vai retomar um pouco do que ele conversou e depois nós vamos abrir para perguntas. Então, se você na terça-feira não conseguiu fazer perguntas, ou assistiu e agora está com alguma dúvida, ou ele vai falar alguma coisa, não se esqueçam que ele escreveu o livro Descriptive Adaptation Studies. É um livro que ele fez. Ele foi a primeira pessoa a colocar isso dentro dos estudos de adaptação, e eu lembro quando eu fui estudar adaptação, eu falava, mas tem os estudos descritivos da tradução, por que não tem os estudos descritivos da adaptação? Agora nós temos. Então, eu vou deixar a primeira pessoa ele vai apresentar isso, e depois o professor dentro vai falar um pouquinho, e vocês podem colocar as perguntas no chat que eu coloco aqui. Obrigada.
Okay, good afternoon. And this will be speaking in English, I think, for the rest of the afternoon. Well, just a brief introduction here. Patrick Cattrysse teaches narrative studies and adaptation studies at the Universiteit Antwerp, and screenwriting studies at Université Libre de Bruxelles. He has published internationally on these subjects. So I get the impression Patrick teaches in Dutch, in Antwerp, and French in Brussels. Is that right?
Yes, and I used to teach in English in the Netherlands, yes, to Emerson College.
Okay. So it's even a situation of teaching in French in the morning, English in the afternoon, and Dutch in the evening. Patrick is the author of Descriptive Adaptation Studies, Epistemological and Methodological Studies, and he's the editor of Transcultural Screenwriting, Telling Stories for a Global World, and has published a large number of articles in the area on translation studies, adaptation studies, and the crossover between the two areas. Indeed, he's one of the few people to have a foot in both areas, in both disciplines, and this is one of the themes we're going to be talking about today. Initially, Patrick is going to be talking for a few minutes, and then we're going to open out to questions, etc. Patrick.
Okay, thank you for these kind words. My more recent work in translation and adaptation studies has taken a turn, which seems to be a popular term in the historical study of translation studies and other disciplines. Whereas for decades I have been working on or looking at similarities between translation studies and adaptation studies. And maybe I have underestimated some interpretations of these approaches, underestimated as in translation scholars may be assuming that adaptation is studied as if it were a form of translation, because this is, without realizing, I didn't realize, this is not what I thought. What I thought was like, I have two distinct objects of study, but there are similarities, like between the raven and the writing desk, if you think of Alice in Wonderland. And because of those similarities, there are features in the concepts and methodology of translation studies that could be useful if and when studying a rather different object of study, which was actually the literary film adaptation, the making of films based on novels mostly. So that has been for a few decades my main point of interest, until a few years ago, I realized that colleagues in various disciplines in translation studies and adaptation studies, literary film adaptation studies, but also in a re-emerging transmedia or intermediarity studies, I noticed that colleagues in these three areas ended up making the same claims about, to call it a bit disrespectfully maybe, the same disciplinary turf, meaning all three claim to study all meaning-making phenomena, regardless of the means of expression, which triggered somehow, at least in me, the turning point, as in, okay, but if we have like intertextual, translational, adaptational, intermedial, 4 words to say exactly the same thing, and maybe 4 groups, 4 academic communities working on the same subject, then why use 3 or 4 terms if everyone is doing the same thing? And if they are not, then how can we somehow agree on boundaries, which luckily for me was about the subject of this conference. And this is where I started looking into, okay, now we've seen that there are lots of interesting and important commonalities. What about possible differences, so that since there's too much work for everyone anyway, we can somehow partition, we can somehow divide the working load, the sort of division of labor, and agree on those infamous boundaries. And this is what led me to looking around, trying not to reinvent the wheel, looking at, which has happened a bit too often to my taste, what has been done before, where I thought, oh, I'm inventing something, and then looking further and reading more, and then finding out that the Greeks had been talking about this 2,000 years ago already, time and again. Very frustrating. But theories of definition was one of those things. I thought, okay, yes, I have something, and then seems like this is part of philosophy for 2,000 years. And I'm not going to repeat everything about theories of definition, but there is a lot of interesting stuff that has been developed there, that since this is about definitions, that I think could help all the communities involved in figuring out a way to develop a meta language, so that as we speak, not Portuguese, and I'm thankful for you to speak Greek here, not Portuguese, but English here, Greek, I'm obsessed. So that we use the same meta language. So I'll get to this in a minute. For example, one of the important features in what I learned, at least in these theories of definition, is that the definer needs to be integrated into the definer. I noticed that they have lots of different types of definitions, and I'm not going into this, but it turns out that defining the phenomena seems not to be that difficult. What seems to be much more difficult is having a community of colleagues agree on one definition to name a common set of phenomena in the world. That seems to be far more difficult. The second set of theories that I think that has been helpful, and I think can be more helpful, has to do with theories of categorization. If we understand certain phenomena and we label them translational, and we try to distinguish them from other phenomena, and we call them adaptational, that's categorizing. That's apparently a reflex which in evolutionary and biological studies and psychological studies is understood to be unavoidable. All living organisms, including human primates, including academics, categorize. To categorize means to see something as something, to perceive something as something. It doesn't take more than that, and you're it. So whether you are a hardcore relativist or a positivist or whatever, all we can do is categorize in certain ways to glue a name on it and talk about stuff. What's interesting about this categorization, or the more recent categorization, this time unlike the Greek, is that Wittgenstein and other people have started taking distances from Aristotle's absolute either-or categorizing, and allowing for what is sometimes called family resemblance, a notion that you may have heard of, which allows for what is called graded category membership, meaning some members of a family may be more typical than others. And you may even have members in a family that share a feature that is not common to all. So there's interesting stuff in there, but it means that unlike what still we tend to do is to think in either or categories, either something is a square or it's not, either something is a translation or it's not. If we allow for this, it's more translational, it's more adaptational. There are ways out, perhaps, in this debate about distinguishing sets of phenomena, and again, naming them in ways that we can collectively more or less agree upon, so that we know what we're talking about. Even if then we say, no, we disagree about this or that, we have a language with which we can say we disagree, for example, or we agree. In that subfield, I have come, for example, to a conclusion, which at least one participant in the previous lecture did not agree with, that it is more helpful to use narrow categories than wider categories. Narrow categories tend to be more homogeneous, wider categories tend to be more heterogeneous. And there are a number of advantages, I'm not going to repeat those, but one of the misunderstandings and one of the arguments that is often used against them, which I think is not valid, or maybe other valid arguments, I won't doubt that, but the misunderstanding, confusion is that narrow categories would be rigid and wider categories would be flexible. And I think that's a mistake. If, for example, as I proposed in the other lecture, we agree, just for this lecture, that to call, translation invariance oriented and adaptation, as in a biological sense, variance oriented, there is no reason then the meaning would be more narrow for translation, unlike people who call translation semiosis, or people, scholars who have called translation culture even. Everything we understand, everything we value. So if we would narrow down and say, no, okay, we will call these phenomena, which are invariance-oriented, translational. We'll call the other phenomena, which are variance-oriented and entail better fit, we'll call those adaptational. Then those two definitions will be more narrow. There's no reason whatsoever to assume that when we look at those phenomena, that they would be more rigid or more flexible. The rigid or flexible, static or dynamic features have to do with a different analytical view, which is called synchronic or diachronic. We look at how things are if you're focusing on a Parmenidean view on, okay, what remains the same in the world? And if you're interested in what is changing, then of course that view will not do. Then we need to swap lenses and take on the Heraclitean view if you want. This is an extreme case, but looking at things that change. And so that's my argument, that the synchronic and diachronic view is one divide, which is better to separate from the rigid, flexible, or narrow, wider category that we can distinguish. What else? Yes, defining is easier than having colleagues agree on definitions, leads to an upcoming new discipline, which is called Interdisciplinarity Studies, which deals with science research, not only as an epistemic issue, but as a social practice, where academics, researchers, people, humans, live, eat, work, and so forth. And science is seen as a social practice within life, where then you end up with proponents and opponents, for example, of boundaries of categories, which may use epistemic arguments, knowledge-oriented, knowledge-based, but who may also use political, social arguments to further their career, to get tutorship, to pay, for the whatever, to sustain a family, and so forth. And those, well, I'm separating them now again into probabilistic categories, epistemic and social, but the interests and the motivations of those two are not always, they do not always align. They can be conflictuous. And so it might be interesting to see, okay, for example, a wider definition of an object of study might be politically or socially an interesting move, because then you spread your field of study, you have more chances of getting funds, you get more power in the field, whatever. But from an epistemic point of view, things may be different, and interests, pro and cons may be different. And this leads to this field, interdisciplinarity studies. And where do we find translation studies and the moves that are there for epistemic reasons or for social reasons? Where do we find other disciplines like adaptation studies and so forth? And the arguments against the boundaries, pro and contra, it might be interesting to see, which interests they serve: epistemic, disciplinary, combined, why, how, a debate on its own. And the last point I would to point out is, I think I'm actually replying on a question in the last session, in the previous session. It's important, I think, to understand the difference, because the reply was, yes, narrow categories are, we need to widen categories to be flexible, because things change so quickly in our modern world, which is, I think, a confusion between those two divides I explained. But I also think it's important to distinguish between the dynamics of an object of study, phenomena and things we do in the world that change, and the meta language that we need to discuss about those changing things in the world. And if for now I say table, but 10 seconds, table means door, and 10 seconds afterwards, door means car, you understand what I mean? Communication is lost, we're done. So that's what language is about. It's fixating. That's what we need the notion of presence, or present next to past and future for, to be able to fixate at least a snapshot of this changing reality, to be able to talk to each other, to say we agree or we disagree. And that's what this definition or defining and meta language is about. Fixating, at least for the time of our communication, to exchange information, because that's what language is about. What changes? Yes. And let go of the notion that we can one-on-one copy-paste, and register in our perception and in our communication how the world in all its complexity and dynamics is. We can just try to do as good as it gets, which is a move I like. But I'll stop there. John, your mic is still.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. And I'm going to come in now. Okay. Please put your questions. Send your questions. I think Sylvia's putting them together.
Yes, uma coisa, gente, não tem problema, escrevam as perguntas em português, tá? A gente traduz aqui mesmo, não tem problema, tá? Não vai ficar assim.
Francês, holandês,
espanhol,
grego,
galego.
Unfortunately, my Portuguese is non-existent.
Yeah, okay. All right, well, the first point I'd like to make is, in the epistemological area, is the traditional university idea of specialization. Doing your dissertation, your thesis on that one tiny thing. We receive a lot of proposals, for example, 2 Portuguese translations of Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, comparing them, possibly proposing solutions for a better translation. That is, if you like, the typical thesis, dissertation proposal we get. Looking at a translation of an unknown author which has not been translated yet into Portuguese. So, we're having this, Sylvia and myself, trying to encourage wider studies. But still, this is the idea of the traditional thesis. I think the other point I'd like to make, and I gave this in my presentation the other day, is this idea of you use the word turf. Everybody has their own turf. And when somebody else goes into that turf, a lot of scholars, specialists do not like it. Translation studies has its own turf. Adaptation studies has its own turf. And nowadays we're talking more and more about transmedia studies or intercultural studies. I think you use 4 different areas. I was using 3 different areas. When I found out about translation studies, about 2008, I'd never heard of it previously, and I remember
John, adaptation studies. You found out.
What did I say?
You said translation.
Sorry, sorry. Okay, I'm getting confused between the different. Sorry, I'd been in translation studies since 1990.
Yeah,
yeah, much earlier. And then I had never heard of translation studies.
Adaptation.
What am I talking about? Sorry. Okay, correct me. Okay.
You see, it's a linguistic thing.
Okay, I'd been in translation studies right from 1980 odd. I only heard the word adaptation studies in, I think it was 2008. Indeed, many people in the translation studies area had not even heard of adaptation studies. I went to a congress in 2009 in, where was it? Australia. And I remember I gave a paper on translation studies, adaptation studies. Maria Timoshko, one of the leading studies in translation, one of the leading scholars in translation studies, had not even heard about adaptation studies. In this book, Enlarging Translation, Empowering Translators, in which she proposes that translation should open itself up, she uses the word representation as one of the modes of opening up. She does not even mention the word adaptation. So typically, Maria Timoshko had, presumably she'd not read your work. Maria Timoshko, if you like, as a, I don't know if you can use the word typical translation studies scholar, had not even heard about adaptation studies, in the same way as the great majority of people working in adaptation studies, to a great extent English monolingual, had not even heard about translation studies. I use in the text I wrote, I think I came across the term, I think it can be used equally in English. I heard to the term deux solitudes, two solitudes, talking about Canada, Quebec and Anglo-Canada, or of course Belgium. We can use equally the term Belgium, Flemish and Wallon, Flamingos and Wallon. Two groups with their own turf, on their own turf, with little contact, just about ignoring each other. In the text I wrote in 2009, I was a bit too optimistic. I was saying, people should open up, people should have conferences, publications together. 12 years after, I don't find that. We invited, you probably know the article by Audrey Canales. We invited her to speak at this conference. I don't know, she disappeared, so I don't know what happened to her.
She didn't come?
A new job. No, she had a new job. Initially, she was keen.
Coming the first day. Yeah, she was coming the first day.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to her. She was talking about a new job. I don't know if that... in the article, which, basically I ended up summarizing a lot of her article in TTR, which repeated and extended a lot of the ideas I'd used, but also bringing in intermedial, transmedial studies. So instead of these deux solitudes, two solitudes, we now have trois solitudes, or even quatre solitudes. Patrick.
Yes. Yes. I think it started. I think disciplinary worries started when, at least that's my experience, when literary film scholars in that famous year 2008, because a few things happened then, expressed the ambition to step beyond the literature film paradigm and study all media expressions. You have to know that the inflation of translation as a cross-natural language use phenomenon into all types of intertextual types of text processing started earlier in translation studies and took more time in film adaptation studies because I think of the importance of the fidelity discourse in literary studies. But as film studies and media studies legitimized as academic disciplines, the battle for and against fidelity and infidelity, I feel, was more or less lost. And adaptation, which, like translation, by the way, in Kristeva or Christian Metz or Jeanette's intertextual terminology, is a subcategory of intertextuality, and that's my fourth party, was inflated into translation became every form of intertextual variant, and adaptation became the same. And what I find interesting is that so far, no one was worried. On the translational point of view, you saw like a more imperialist, I'm sorry to say, and there's nothing bad about good imperialists. If they're good, you saw a somewhat more of an imperialist move. And for a long time, I'd say that film adaptation studies have led a protectionist policy, sticking to the lit film paradigm, keeping everyone out, which somehow I think...
TV, even TV.
Yeah. Yes, TV is...
But now it's all together.
Exactly. And so, but as long as ambitions stuck to intertextual ambitions, apparently there were no disciplinary turf worries. And I think that changed around 2008. And then you can see, and I traced somewhere in some publications, some conferences back, starting with Cyprus, starting with here in Louvain, with translation scholars and lit film scholars sending out international invitations to conferences, and transmedia scholars starting to meet and to meet people in the flesh and to see, oh, you really exist. Oh, there is something like translation studies for adaptation studies and adaptation studies for translation studies. And the third dog now for the same bone, media studies, transmedia studies, Lars Elleström and many other people. And I think that it's the move not from translation and adaptation to all intertextual categories, but the move from the transmedial move that has worried probably all parties involved. And there are some interesting studies in transmedia studies who actually quite convincingly show that disciplines align rather with medial borders than, for example, with intertextual borders. So this would fit the argument or the explanation that indeed, as soon as someone starts to transgress the linguistic borders or the lit film borders or some other border, that becomes tricky, because then you start to really shake the gates of the interdisciplinary or the disciplinary, the intradisciplinary boundaries, and then people have to start to talk, at least to meet to begin with. And my argument would be now, and this is what I'm working on from a recent publication, is that maybe a way out could be if we understood translation and we redefined translation and adaptation as they were in the 1960s, intertextual subcategories next to sequel, prequel, remake, and what have you, but as intermedial superordinate categories which are media agnostic. And then you could find translation as an invariance-oriented phenomenon applied in numerous medially applied forms like cross-lingual translation, like lit film translation, like painting, music translation, like whatever, and the same for adaptation. And this could somehow then maybe renegotiate, this turf or this division of labor, or And then there's still a way to figure out the relation between media or transmedia studies and the former intertextuality studies.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you understand this in semiotic terms, then text, since Kristeva and since Metz, does not mean what, I understand why, but does not mean what linguistics or literary scholars like to call verbal text, but text is understood as a cluster of signs. A number of things which somehow, when humans or sentient beings interact with them, seem to be structured and trigger sense.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be a painting, a picture, a movie, a house, a building, a novel. And then the text in a Persian sense would be the larger term consisting of a sign form, an interpretant, and an object. And media studies could be seen as focusing on the sign form, and intertextuality studies could be seen as the umbrella term hosting, the various categories. But there's a lot of opposition and obstacles, in the way. Again, proposing the definition is easy. Finding commonalities in the community will be very much more difficult.
Exactly. We are stuck. Sylvia and myself both come from kind of literature background. Sylvia was working with, she's basically how do you say in English, Cervantist.
Right.
Yeah, who don't seem to like, from what Sylvia says, who don't seem to like translation or adaptation very much.
No.
I'll bring you in a minute, Sylvia. Let me just come.
Yeah.
And so we've come up with translation studies. And then, of course, this Congress was organized by San José do Rio Preto, where they have a strong undergraduate course in translation studies. We find a lot of people now working with adaptations in the literary area, in the film area. And recently, the book, the Rutledge, in the study group, next year we're going to be studying the Rutledge Handbook of what's it called? Intermediate Studies.
No, was transmedia. No, was transmedia. Lenida,
yeah, I have it somewhere.
Yeah, you have it there. Okay.
Rutledge Handbook of Transmedia Studies.
Transmedia Studies.
Transmedia. We even find that one of the editors is Brazilian, working in Belo Horizonte, Minas Gerais, in a media studies department, and of course we had never heard of her at all. And we've made contact as well. So working in people, as I said, just continue this image of the trois, quatre solitude, working in parallel and having absolutely no contact throughout your whole careers. And then, of course, if you're working in translation studies, if you're teaching translation, if you're teaching a translation, maybe your classes are on technical translation, you have your workload, you have your research. I think in some cases it's a case of no time to do anything else, concentrating on what you have. I don't know. Sylvia, well, I bring Sylvia in, and any questions?
Yeah, we're starting to have some questions here. No, just telling what John was saying. Really, when I started to work with Cervantes on the translation of Cervantes in Brazil, and then obviously I work on a catalog, so I found a lot of works, and then a lot of translations and for kids and theater plays. Cordel, there is the we call like chapbooks, the old things here, the pliegos sueltos in Spanish they call, or colpotrage in French. And they still do this in Brazil, in the northeast of Brazil. So we have these two comics. And was really hard to start working with this in the academy because they, wasn't very, wasn't matching, Cervantes and something so commonly found any place like a children's book, just with Quixote and Sancho Panza just, playing around. And I really would love if you can talk a little bit more about this Romanticism 2.0, because since I started to work on adaptations, especially on Quixote, and then I saw with another classics, the romantics just, they mess it forever. So Quixote is always expected to be this guy saving the humanity, and Pancho, this guy that wants to eat all the time. And even when I studied Quixote in the Escolas de Samba in Brazil, so also, again, you see Don Quixote coming and saving Brazil from poverty, from all the races, all the corruption problems, everything. And he's there saving everyone. So I even wrote about this, this never-ending romantic approach. So when I saw you talking about that, I said, oh my God, Romanticism 2.0, this is what I want. So if you can talk about a little bit about this, it was so good to meet you. Find someone to. Anthony Close talks about it in Cervantes, but I never saw someone talking about this about on translation, and like you said, on adaptation.
Actually, it's. I get my mustard from. I don't know if you can see this.
Oh my God, this is great. The invention of art.
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna write it here. The invention of art. Yeah.
Larry Scheiner. Larry Scheiner.
Okay.
And he describes far better than I could ever, because he has this encyclopedic knowledge, how since the 1400s, what we know is the Romantic ideology, but then very often as a mid-19th century literary fashion. But he describes how, in a very small way, near the end of the 1400s, in some art divisions, this ideology is going to start and develops step by step, grabbing a value at the left, grabbing a value at the right, joining, merging with something else, until it becomes what many know in the 1800s, somewhere between the 1800s and 1850. And he explains at the same time how this creates this Western invention, what he calls this, our Western recent, actually, because it's not that old, 1800s, it's like 200 years old, Western invention of the notion of art, what the intelligentsia and the leaders in our Western societies stipulate will be art or not. And it drives actually a wedge between art that is then redefined as high art and craft, which was united before that for 2000 years. It's actually that evolution that continues, where you see then what people call postmodernism. You see features of postmodernism sipping into that romantic view, and there's been critics explaining much better than I can do how neoliberal values like me first, the originality, difference for the sake of difference, and all those well-known values.
I love that you said about this, the purity of, this is when I said, oh my God, this is what they always talking when they, they talk bad about adaptations of Quixote. Oh my God, they stole Cervantes' spirit. I don't know what. Oh my God. And yeah. Cervantes, he wasn't like that, he loved all the things that, he wrote everything wrong for Sancho, and the people was like correcting everything for ages. So
that's what he describes as well. So it's very interesting if you have his knowledge of all those artists and all that work, but also all that criticism, because there has been a kind of revisionism.
Yes.
Of rewriting the history of Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and so forth, to comply with that romantic ideology, to make them fit into their heroism, altruism, ego tripper, and so forth and so forth. And it's amazing. But anyway, so that's an interesting, fascinating little battle I'm fighting. But it's also one of the major obstacles, and maybe, I don't know, translation scholars will contradict me, why, for example, in the 1970s, translation scholars to begin with, and why they were the first to have to flee from craftsmanship, from accurate translation, from something that reproduces someone else's discourse in a craftful, correct, accurate, precise, just in time, just in place way. Instead it had to be expressing oneself, being oneself, not having anything to do with the translated, being original, being independent, because dependence means weakness, and relying on someone or sharing with someone would be weakness as well, and independence would be strong or strength. Those romantic 2.0 notions. And this is what I mean. It's a kind of ideology that has taken about 500 years. So it's not ready to go away.
Oh my God.
Okay, we can.
That's what is needed if you would redefine, for example, translation as invariant and adaptation as variance. By the way, on this view, adaptation would not be more free or less free than translation. It would be just conditioned by different factors. That's all. So that obsession with this freedom, which more and more scientific research proves to be an illusion, which is another very interesting topic. It doesn't exist. We like to believe in it, and that's why we do. But if we could get rid of those illusions, then this definition, or this pact between translation and what it is used for, and adaptation and what it can be used for, could be put on an equal basis. You put aside those romantic values, you return to the pre-romantic values, which reconcile both, and you would have a much wider view. You would have also reconciliation between vocational training and academic training, between practical research or practice-based research and so-called fundamental research, and go on. You can go on for a while.
Oh, thank you. Fala, John.
Okay.
We already have some questions.
Yeah. We'll go into them in a second. Of course, This is encapsulated in Shelley's expression, the violet in the crucible. Translation is like a violet in the crucible. It is destroyed immediately by the fire. Just going back to Quixote, as Sylvia knows, Quixote, I remember clearly when I was 3 years old, in upstairs bedroom in Birmingham, my mother reading with me a book about a funny thin man and a short, fat, gluttonous man. We're even going to try to find the edition, which I was doing. That was the first book I remember. Let's go to the questions. They're actually on chat.
Yes. Yeah. You wanna read it, John, or?
No. Yeah, we can read them together.
Yeah.
Okay. If Patrick can see them if he wants, let's go down. Let's read them all together, and then maybe we can see what we get. Cassio Greco. Professor, what are your thoughts on fidelity criticism? And another question, how important do you reckon it is to include paratextual material pertinent to the adapted text and to the film? Fernando Martins, concerning transmedia phenomena, how could we incorporate fan fictions or fan films into adaptation studies? Then from Samira Saboya, I wish your books were available in Brazil. I'm having a hard time trying to find your books on paper to buy. I guess I'm an old-fashioned reader. Yeah. I mean, I just downloaded your book. I was having trouble to find it. I mean, this is one of the phenomena, of course. If Venuti had published his Translator's Invisibility in a small academic American press, nobody would know anything about him. If Cattrysse had published his book with Rutledge or Bloomsbury or Longman or somebody, everybody would know him.
Yes.
Okay, Patrick.
You can download. So please go to academia.
I just did that a couple of hours ago, actually.
Yeah, and I've put the PDF. Unfortunately, it's with some typos, but at least then you have the text. The publisher is not equipped to publish outside Belgium, so I had to publish very quickly because for other reasons. But you can and please do so for free. You can download the PDF from academia. Maybe I can start with the first question about fidelity criticism. John just mentioned Eventuar Turi, and this is where I started also in the mid 1980s with translation studies and adaptation studies. And with an attempt to, instead of describing how good translation should be and how good adaptation should be, trying to describe how people have adapted actually and how they have translated. And this has been called later on a descriptive approach, not an objective approach, by the way, but that's another story, but a descriptive approach. It's subjective, but it's describing how things are rather than describing how they should be. And if you do that, then fidelity criticism is about people who are in favor of fidelity, like infidelity criticism is about people who are in favor of infidelity. And as far as I'm concerned, a scientist or someone who describes and tries to explain what people have done shouldn't take part in this debate. Maybe he or he may have a personal opinion, but as far as I'm concerned, in this type of job, you keep your opinion for yourself. If you are a critic, who has a job or has, to convey taste, values, or if you're a teacher who stands for one point of view rather than for another, that's a different story. And then you will take sides either for or against fidelity. So that would be my answer to, I'm not sure I answered the question, but that would be my answer to that question. It's a matter of taste. How important do you reckon it is to include paratextual material pertinent to the adapted text? To the extent that you have the time and the means to study as many factors as possible, but not all, to describe and explain, for example, adaptational or translational practices, I think paratexts can be will probably be useful as part of that study. If that is the answer, maybe people can ask more questions if I'm not clear enough. Concerning the transmedia phenomena, how could we incorporate fan fiction and fan films into adaptation studies? I think they are already incorporated. And I think in the Oxford Handbook of Adaptation by Thomas Leach, there are some, if not in other works, and in transmedial studies, there are also already studies on fan fictions and fan films. Sometimes, as John mentioned, the word adaptation is not used, but so, like Jenkins, for example, in his convergent culture, rejects the word adaptation, and some transmedia scholars will not use the term adaptation either, because of Romanticism 2.0, meaning it suggests some kind of a derivative. It suggests something that, even though it might be magnificently well made and it may require virtuoso skills, it's not original. It's not different. So then they will either narrow their views and look on things that somehow have been made simultaneously, but avoid any pretext, post-text relationship, because they have this Pavlovian reflex of hierarchizing, what came before and what came after. They can just not stop themselves judging, the one as superior and the other as inferior. My point again is, if we could skip 500 years and we put aside this reflex, we can study them, describe them for whatever they are, and leave the judgment to critics. But in the meantime, we are where we are. Let's see. Then there's another about women in love to Professor Lambert. For advice. Thank you. Okay, thank you. My greetings to Jose. It's been a long time. I haven't seen him. I thought perhaps he would be here, but he isn't.
I thought he was in Belgium now.
It's been ages since I heard or saw him. I don't know.
Yeah. I was in touch with him. He was going back to Belgium, I think, because of the crisis.
Yeah.
Of course, you were a student of his, were you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I made my PhD with him. So with him at the letters faculty, and with another promoter at the film studies faculty.
Okay. Patrick, our research group of people are asking here if how can we get the permission to translate the book, because we have a publishing house owner in the group, so we are translators, so they are asking how we can do that. If there's a possibility, I don't know, we'll be interested to do that.
That would be great.
Well, we can talk. I can send you an email, but I'm happy to know that it's a possibility, because I'm sure that we're going to be a very good translation.
I don't think you'll get much money for it though.
No,
but you're going to get a lot of promotion in Brazil.
It's not going to be less than what I'm getting now. I'm considering stopping my contract with the publisher now, and actually, what I would find even a better idea is like rewrite or co-write, the book in for example, Brazilian Portuguese.
This will be great.
Because then the only permission you would need is mine.
Okay, because we have a lot of people here in Brazil working with adaptation, and it's even growing. I was really amazed in this last jornada. We have more papers on adaptation than translation, the classical translation. And it's really growing in Santa Catarina, where José Lambert works, in Pernambuco, I don't know, in Belo Horizonte.
Yeah.
This person, so it's really a good thing. I think that so people can know your work. It's gonna be good.
Is he called Juliana Franco? What's her name again?
Know her. Juliana.
Eliana.
Yes.
No, maybe Eliana Franco was in Fortaleza. No, she left academia. And to work commercially in the area of audio description. Last I heard, I had contact with her. I think she was in Portugal. I think she got a bit sick, a bit tired with the academic world, and had a lot of energy and began working, as I said, with commercial audio description. I'm not quite sure how her career went from there. Actually, she's another possibility, somebody we can invite for the Friday sessions. Let me.
There's another question.
I would like to So please write me, and I think we just.
Yes, we're gonna write you about that. It's a great project for our group. It will be a great.
I'd love to. I'd love to. Really.
Yeah.
Great.
I have a question. It's Marley's question.
Okay.
The field of adaptation studies seems to be getting more and more inter and multidisciplinary. What do you think are the most important new areas to incorporate into our studies?
Into our studies? Depends on what the our means.
Marley, I think, speaks as a scholar of adaptation studies.
Yeah.
She's done work on favelas.
Yeah, and film and culture.
In film.
I think this is an intuition based on how I see, the three fields: translation studies, adaptation studies, and intermediate studies evolve. To cut nature at its joints, as Plato said. Maybe the more practical way would be to follow the road, the boundaries that have already naturally, organically almost, been taken, which is that of medium specificity. meaning that if you look at, even if you have multimodal translation studies and intersemiotic translation studies, you see that most translation scholars are linguistics-based or literary-based, meaning they know language first. And a similar medium-specific expertise can be found in lit film studies or in media studies, like Jenkins and Ellerström. So I think the medium as a material form of expression for content would probably be the most practical dividing line to somehow install a division of labor, which does not mean that then you cannot have crossovers. My point is always that you can only have crossovers if there is something to cross over. And which makes sense, right? So that would be, that's my intuition for now, as I see it.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here who I think we could also help her, but it'd be interesting to hear your ideas. From Samira Saboya, I'm working with the translation of dialogues in D.H. Lawrence's Women in Love to the screen. My advisor is José Lambert. She must be from Sylvie. José is now in Ceará.
Ah, okay, I didn't know.
Yeah. Could you give me any suggestions of other scholars I could read? So, we could give her some ideas. Who would you, if she's doing, Samira, I think is probably doing an MA. Who would you from the top of your head tell her to read? Dialogues in Women in Love to the Screen.
Rip Davis.
Who's that? I don't know this person. Yeah,
Rip Davis is it's.
Can you write it here and then I pass here in the. Yes, she said that she's from Poet UFC.
Yeah, that must be.
Yes.
Yeah, that must be MA, I think.
Yeah.
How do you spell Rip?
Rip Davis. Okay. Great. What a strange name.
Rib Davis.
But this is screenwriting. This is about writing dialogue. Screenwriting.
Okay,
So I'm not sure it would be coming from a different perspective. But it might be because if it sits somewhere in between the fields, there's not much written and not many studies about dialogue writing in screenwriting or in filmmaking. So if anyone would put his or her feet into that, I think it would be innovating and
well the one suggestion I would give, he's not an academic. In fact, people call him the king, the emperor of screenwriting, Andrew Davis. There are interviews available with him. He's the one who's done Jane Austen and many other
House of Cards. He wrote House of Cards for TV, well. For BBC.
So I recommend there are interviews by him. If Samira gets in touch with me, J. Milton at USP BR.
Eu tô colocando aqui, John.
Yeah, I can send her material, interviews with Andrew Davis, material by Andrew Davis. He's the one person who has really made adaptations so popular and central to television viewing, particularly not just in Britain but right around the world. He's the one who invented the famous scene in the BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, where Darcy jumped into the lake to swim in the lake and appeared before Lizzie Bennet all wet, which started in a considerable fashion in kind of wet clothes. And
sure, this is about dialogue, John.
Darcy Mania. Well, he's inventing the dialogue. Okay, well, Andrew Davis is Andrew Davis. I think no relation to Rib Davis is my recommendation.
But dialogue writing and this Google dialogue writing, and there's going to be plenty of.
Oh yes. I'm gonna see.
Okay, I've got here your book on page 24 of your book, adaptations. What's it called? Film adaptation studies. Let me see.
Descriptive adaptation studies. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. There are 4 criticisms that have been repeated for decades in the field of literature into film studies. Page 23. Now, maybe if I read through these, since the book was published, which of these have been developed and which have still are undeveloped? I'll read them out for people. Adaptation studies consist mostly of an endless accumulation of ad hoc selected case studies comparing one literary text with its film adaptation. As such, literary adaptation studies generally focuses on the adaptation of canonical literary texts, reducing thereby the concept of film adaptation to that of the literary film with a capital L. As such, literary adaptation studies is mainly interested in the faithful reproduction of literary masterpieces. Adaptation study shows a lack of methodological coherence and also a lack of meta-theoretical reflection. And I think there's a final one. No, I can't find it. Yeah. There's also a lack of a theory of development of theory of adaptation. Lacking development of a theory of adaptation. Now, which of these, I would say that in more recent studies, a number of these have been developed. We find, as in Tom Leach's, the handbook Tom Leach edited, there's quite a number of articles on the history of adaptation, more and more work on different genres, not just film adaptation. We have the study of film adaptation manuals on screenwriting. Yeah, this is exactly what Samira was asking about. And we find more and more work in transmedia. So I would say of this list, just about all of the topics have become more and more popular. Would you agree?
Or have been complemented, yes.
Yeah. So I would say, I don't know if people were reading this, but there is a lot being done in the different areas.
Yeah.
Rick,
there's also been a lot done without using the word adaptation. Actually, if you look at those studies, like art studies, for example, they deal with a lot of adaptational phenomena. But again, because of the reasons I explained, they will not use the word adaptation, much less the word influenced, which is even worse, at least in that respect. But they do deal with similar interesting relevant phenomena, which could be put together into the knowledge bag on adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. No. Just I was curious about that thing that we were talking about. Why the film study was so selective and just now is accepting series and other things, and really now it's it's ridiculous saying that at the beginning we were working with John and dividing a film and TV and social media, and then we saw that today's everything's the same. Applications, you watch movies and now the series became like movies, and nobody they prefer rather working on series, even Hollywood people and very important people. I would like to know your impressions on this movement, new things coming on, streaming, mixing media with film and TV and social media.
I don't have that crystal ball, unfortunately, so I'd like to, but just to give you another example or small anecdote, maybe of how old I am getting. when I was in college, what we call college in Belgium here is secondary school, and it was we call it internship, but that's another name. So we, as pupils, we had to stay there the whole week. We slept there, we lived there, and then on Saturday afternoon we went home. And when we were in the study, for example, I remember I liked to read comics, but you had not to be caught reading comics, because if you were reading something with pictures, then you had to stay over on Sundays and write punishment. So there you go. Many years ago, I had a friend of mine, colleague of mine, making a PhD on comics and on the. So it's it's a matter of taste. Sometimes people like short skirts, and then 2 years later they like larger skirts, and then they like blue, and then red is the new color, and there you go. And of course the technological innovations which come up with solutions and then create demand help doing that too. I do think there is a kind of and then I'm returning to the invention of art. I do think there's a kind of democratization of the notion of art, which I do think has a lot to do with the coming of social media, where people
the collaborative, the Jenkins things
have a voice now, and in spite of everyone up there gets hurt, whether they like it or not. And which means also that people who grew up with television start studying and then doing stuff they liked, and then get promoted on television, then legitimize television. And the next thing is going to be, if we have presidents now who use Twitter and things like that, though these help to legitimize the use of formerly populist or popular media.
I can come in. Yes. No, I was saying that the video games that they have been studied now in our area, and it was something like this is a game. No, we are not going to study this.
It's amazing that it's lagging behind so long, because it has since long time passed by film, television, and all other media. Gaming is an industry and a cultural phenomenon that extends by far everything else combined together.
These fashions, of course, come and go. I think just before we finish, Sylvia, see if there are any more questions.
No, I'm just I'm looking here. No.
I'll just while we're doing this, I'll just talk about another anecdotal experience. As I've mentioned before, I'm from Birmingham, and Tolkien studied also at King Edward School, but nobody ever talked about him when I was there. In a school where Greek literature, classical literature, was considered to be the summit, the canon, Tolkien was unknown, forgotten, and nobody at the school ever talked about him for some reason. When I was 13, I remember there was a big, enormous wave of popularity for Tolkien, and everybody read him. I didn't myself. But I remember in a divinity class, religion class, when I was 13, a boy was reading Lord of the Rings surreptitiously under the desk, and he was punished for reading Lord of the Rings.
Oh my God!
Now, of course, after that, Tolkien became enormously fashionable, and the city of Birmingham, used Tolkien as a kind of propaganda boy. And if you go to Birmingham, you can go on Tolkien walks and many other things. Very near the house I grew up in, just over a mile away from my mother's house now. So that gives an example. Sylvia, shall we thank Patrick? Do we have any final question?
Yes.
I think we'll thank
everybody here is very excited with the idea that we're going to have something of Patrick Cattrysse in Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, made by great, that, we are all translators here and working on the field. So I think that we're going to have a very, very good thing. People are very happy that you came, because they are saying that it was a more intimate thing, that they could make questions. You know, it was a very short period for question on Tuesday. So thank you very much for coming, for accepting.
Thank you for having me.
So, and everybody's free to go and spend the money on Black Friday now. It's very windy here. It's very
it's true.
windy.
It's true, and it's raining at here.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to cut off there. Thank you very much again, and thank you, Michael. Obrigado a Michael.
Peraí que eu vou me despedir daqui. Gente, obrigada, muito obrigada à Unesp por emprestar o espaço. Normalmente a gente está no canal da FEFELESH USP. Este vídeo também ficará na playlist do canal do GREAT. E nos encontramos o ano que vem. Essa foi a nossa última palestra, fechamos com chave de ouro.
Não temos o grupo, o Silvio.
Não, mas John, o palestras do palestras. As palestras as webinars do GREAT, do Citrate, continuarão o ano que vem, em março. Vamos abrir com a Denise Botman. Então, fiquem de olho nas nossas mídias sociais. Muito obrigado.
Nada de plágio até lá. Okay, Patrick, thank you once again, and we'll keep in touch.
You'll be, yes.
Please
receive
do.
our mail.
Okay.
Yes.